Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of UJ Let's Talk. My name is Cindy Swandala, and today we are discussing this house would privatize Eskom. And to my right-hand side, we have Team Proposition, who is proposing today. And to my left-hand side, we've got Team Opposing, who is opposing. Without further ado, take it, Precious.
I've never been more proud to propose before. So, with load shedding being on stage 6 and you are still in the talking stage, wow. Anyways, over to my speech. Eskom, as we all know, is a primary electricity supplier generating about 90% of South African electricity, right? So what we want to prove today is that transferring this industry to a private sector would actually be more better than keeping it as a public sector, right? So in our debate today, what we are going to prove is the nature of SA's government and SA being broke and you guys still want to keep Eskom public. That is very weird. But anyways, the government already does not have enough resources as we see, and it does not really have the enough resources to also generate this type of electricity, because you can already see that we have a lot of stages from stage 1 to stage 8 of electricity, whereby we survive almost close to 12 hours without electricity. And sometimes because of this power being too much for the electricity, we find that they lead to power outrages whereby electricity disappears for close to 2 days. Anyways, we also will have to look at Eskom's current state, right? The SA economy is already as bad as it is because it is developing. There are high unemployment rates. There is a lot of gaps which shows that they are actually doing a very, very bad job in actually sustaining this type of enterprise or entity. This automatically influences Eskom in regards to they don't have enough money to actually even provide South Africa with electricity. Hence, we have all these unnecessary stages from stage 1 to 8, as I said, finding ourselves without electricity. In this debate, we are burdened to prove that there is an ideal need for change and privatizing Eskom, and as a society as a whole. I will be touching on the negative effects of Eskom currently as a public sector versus the benefits of privatizing Eskom. And my second speaker will emphasize on the inefficiency of Eskom and the implications in society. So what we have to understand is we want to bring change by privatizing Eskom to multiple companies, right? And this will take place obviously between the public sector and the private sector, because they have to come to an actual agreement to why this needs to happen. And we also find that it needs to be done as soon as possible, given that we know that there are specific procedures and protocols followed, and we can see the government is failing. So this is a necessity for Eskom to actually be privatized, because the government is failing to actually provide South African citizens with electricity. And then we also find that the government, obviously, in regards to them handing in this contract, because probably side opposition is going to come up and tell us that if they privatize this, then nobody's going to actually afford this type of, not a lot of people will be able to afford electricity. We already say that in them handing the contract to the private sector, them handing the contract to the private sector, they will also have limitations to how much they can actually charge, so that everyone can actually be able to pay and get electricity from Eskom as a private sector, right? And then we have to focus on how it actually looks right now. We can see that Eskom is failing to provide citizens with electricity. And if it actually changed and has this transformation of it going into the private sector, we know private sectors have a lot of money, so meaning they can actually manage and will be able to deal with this company and make sure that people have electricity, right? They are able to finance and also maintain, and they are moneyed, and money does not disappear into thin air like Eskom right now, because after all, we know our government is corrupt. And then we also have to understand that Eskom is actually also affecting students' lives, because now when there is load shedding, students have to leave their races and go to campuses because some races do not have backup generators, which also leads to students not being certain if they are going to be safe, because now walking to campus at night because you have to study for a test that you're writing tomorrow, you really don't know. Student safety is also at risk here. So if it's private, then we know that most people are actually gonna like be able to get electricity most of the time. So yeah, with that being said, we can see that Eskom is actually failing, and there is a need for change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, team. Proposing, we see that you are definitely for Eskom being privatized. However, over to you, opposing team. Katlego, the floor is yours.
As you know, privatization is the transfer of businesses, industry, or service from a public to a private ownership. And one thing that we know, electricity is a basic need. And as electricity is a basic need, and we also know that we are currently in a crisis, how can we move Eskom from being a public company to a private company when we know that every private company is profit orientated? We know that private companies don't care about people. All they want to make is profit. If they are aiming to make profit, it means they will definitely don't care about how people are able to afford or how people they are able to maintain or buy that electricity. And as we know, they are also transferring control. When we transfer control, it means you no longer have access or whether influence to control the certain thing that you have just transferred your control over. If the Eskom is being moved to the private sector, it simply means government will no longer intervene or have any influence to it. And one other thing that we should know, private companies, they have lack of transparency and accountability. Since their financial statements, they are audited if they only want, which means government will not know how Eskom is being operated since it's a secret to them. People will not know how the government how Eskom operates as a private entity. And one other thing we should touch base on, you touched based on saying that students are moving from their races going to campus because of load shedding. If private companies, since they are the sole owners of those races, how about they provide those students with electricity so that when there's load shedding, they can be able to study by providing them with generators since they can afford. Since you said they have money, they can afford, which simply means they should be the one providing those generators. And one other thing that we should know now, you touched based about the load shedding. Load shedding, it's affecting everyone in South Africa, as we know. But one thing we should know, since load shedding is affecting all of us, we won't deny the fact that Eskom is not good. Eskom is not in a good state. But then we can see that the government is trying to make some means. We know that they're one of the largest coal power stations that have been shut down in Mpumalanga. The government is trying to reopen that power station so that they can combat the thing about load shedding. And one other thing, if there is a shift within organizational structures, it means some employees will be fired. That is a given. We know private companies will come with their new employees. Private companies will come with their new methods of doing things. There are students who are part of Eskom bursary who benefit from Eskom. There are communities that benefit from Eskom. What will happen if there will be such a huge shift? Privatization, the privatization of Eskom will not only affect the company itself, but it will affect the livelihood of other people. As we know, once it shifts, most students will lose their bursaries. How are people going to afford for the same? How people are going to afford for the same electricity if they are unemployed? Remember, when there's an organizational shift, there should always be an organizational structural change, which means people will be fired. Is that what we are looking for? That will increase the unemployment rate. And one other thing, for them to be able to sustain or for them to be able to run while making profit, they should reduce costs. How are we going to reduce costs? As we know, we have variable and fixed costs. The variable costs, they can change, which is labor, which means they will retrench some people so that they can be able to make profit while keeping their costs as low as possible. So meaning, if we privatize Eskom, we will be increasing what? Unemployment. That's one thing for sure. And one other thing that I would like to touch base on, and I'm sure that my second speaker will emphasize, is that if private companies are so good, why don't they partner with Eskom and try to combat this thing of load shedding? And thank you.
Sure. What a mouthful. Thank you very much, Katlego. Back to you, proposing team.
Hello to the House at large. Now I'm the second speaker for the proposition team, and I'd first love to do my rebuttal. Right. So the opposition team comes with this idea of government control and how privatizing Eskom will limit government control, but they haven't told us how government control is essentially a good thing. They haven't told us how this corrupt government that's running Eskom to the ground deserves to control such an important asset such as electricity system in the entirety of South Africa, right? We also get this idea that the private sector cannot be held accountable. I do not understand where this comes from, right? The private sector is still under the law. So if they commit something that's outside of the law, they're going to be held accountable not only by the government and the legal system, but also by their consumers, right? So I'd like to go on to my my matter, right? So firstly, I'd like to define inefficiency, as it's a word I'm going to be using. Inefficiency is when things do not run well. They're not being run properly or in a way that benefits the majority of society, right? And my two main points will be that Eskom and parastatals at large are inefficient by their very nature, and they're costly by their very nature. I'll also be talking about how privatization will help lower the cost of electricity and in turn provide the majority of people in this country with electricity, right? So a parastatal is basically a government-owned and operated entity, right? Like Eskom, right? Okay, parastatals and Eskom are inefficient because they have no incentive to be better. Why do they not have any incentive to be better? Because they have exclusive control to produce and supply specific good, right? In the case of Eskom, it's electricity. They're the only ones who can produce electricity in South Africa. And what does that mean? That means that there's no other competition. There's no one else that is allowed to basically do what they're doing, right? And thus, they can give taxpayers subpar services and products without facing any real tangible consequences, right? We have this, a main idea, an example to illustrate this is Eskom, right? We have Eskom that cannot manage the energy grid, that's giving individuals hours without electricity, depriving millions of South Africans from having electricity and in turn having many other essential services, and they don't have any consequences. The government bails them out. If they are running at a deficit, taxpayers will have to handle the load. Taxes will increase, and that tax will go into paying for Eskom, and also the money from other facilities such as the healthcare sector will have to go to Eskom, right? And we also say that they can raise prices as they please without any, because they're the only one providing the service. So South African people do not have the opportunity to go to another place to get electricity. They have to use Eskom, and they have to pay the prices that Eskom is telling them to pay, right? And we think that that is incredibly inefficient and incredibly wrong. So when we're choosing Eskom, we're deliberately choosing inefficiency, and when we're choosing Eskom, we're choosing to stay in darkness, literally. Okay, so I'd like to contextualize South Africa right now. South Africa is going through one of the worst economic recessions in history, and not only South Africa, but the rest of the world. And on top of that, we're going through an unemployment crisis, and on top of that, we're going through a food crisis. People cannot afford to buy food anymore or to buy basic necessities, right? And what happens if we keep Eskom and we keep parastatals like Eskom in power and to keep them in control of our electrical system, right? What will happen to, number one, investors, number two, small businesses, and number three, the household, the everyday man, right? So we want to say that now, Eskom, we all agree that Eskom is being run inefficiently and the electrical grid is not working as it should be, right? And what does that mean for investors who want to come to South Africa? Investors will not be incentivized to come and invest in this country if the electricity is unreliable. That will cut into their profits. They will be incentivized to go somewhere else, maybe Botswana, where they have a better electrical grid and they have more consistent and reliable electricity, and then they'll take all the jobs and the opportunities and take them to other countries, right? And what about small businesses? Small businesses are suffering right now because during a lot of them cannot afford generators, etc. And during load shedding, they have to close down, and that will mean that it's cutting into their profits, and they won't be able to employ the people that they employ, right? And eventually, some of them will go out of business. And we know that a very large percentage of the South African population is employed in small businesses, right? And also households, right? Like essential goods like water, like pumping water, that's not going to be able to be delivered to the average household. And that is why privatization works better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a mouthful. One more time over to the opposing team.
Right, once more, my name is Alex, and I will be doing some sort of responsive, integrated rebuttal with my case as well. Cool. So what we get then, mostly from proposition, is this idea to say that, okay, we're in a crisis right now. Great, we concede to that. The crisis has to do with Eskom not being able to be efficient enough or not being able to be effective to provide that basic need under governments like I. Cool, great. We concede to that because that is exactly what is happening. However, they haven't told us anything or any reasoning as to why private companies or the private sector actually then would be better off. The only thing that we hear is this idea of funding, and magically funding is supposed to like fix everything, right? So this is not the case, because we do realize that it takes more than just funding for you to be able to actually like run an Eskom, especially at the point at which they also concede to the fact that Eskom is the very same parastatal that's servicing over 90% of electricity to supplying them to the rest of society. Right? That's just the first point of contention, but we'll get to that in my substantive matter as well. Secondly then, what we get is this idea of government control and how that is like a good or a bad thing. Apparently we needed to like clarify that, right? So let me just do that real quick, right? So when we talk about government control, especially at the point at which we're talking about the most basic resource or the most basic necessity that every individual needs in the country, which is electricity, we think that government is then the best actor for this, or the best person to actually be able to assume an onus on this. Why? Katlego has already alluded to the fact that, first of all, the whole reason why private companies actually then do exist is to have like a sort of profit incentive. We already know that government actually then have to be the ones who protect their citizens and who are the ones who service them at the best of their ability, right? The moment that you actually take that away from government, it no longer becomes like a thing that we actually have to prioritize the person over profit. It becomes profit over the person. This is exactly why we want government control. Whether or not it's good or bad, we think that the responsibility tied to it is something that innately has to do with the government, right? But then also lastly, in terms of accountability then, and accountability within the private sector, we think that it's not going to be able to be something that then thrives. Why? Because Katlego already alluded to the fact that accountability is not something that you would really easily get access to even in that instance of a private sector. Why? Because private companies aren't required, much like public companies, to actually then have their like records out in public, right? It's something that is privatized. So then how do we then know that their funding is just the only thing then that's going to work if you can't even see what this funding is actually then being used for? That's what we were trying to allude with that. But then let's get to the actual contention of the matter that we're actually facing today, right? So we already alluded to the fact that funding is not the only problem that we have to worry about. Yes, government is having a problem with regards to funding and funding Eskom, but management is also something that is essentially important. We think that no matter the amount of funds that you do have, when you have a management problem or a management crisis, it's still going to be a problem at the end of the day. Your priority isn't to actually isn't to actually service electricity to everybody, but rather to actually profit from it, right? Cool. What does this then lead to? Since we already alluded to the fact that this is an urgent matter, we can't have or can't risk the idea of actually then taking a whole industry that has been there for over a lot of years, I think it's safe to say over 50 years, and then just transferred to the private sector as if it's just some normal business deal. You mentioned a contract, and that is not what's going to be happening here, because private companies still legally have the choice of actually being able to prioritize profit over people. But then over and above that, we think that the type of structural change that is going to happen with regards to this policy is not something that's going to be done as soon as possible. It's an industry that has been there for a very long time, so this problem isn't going to be fixed merely just by that.
All I'm going to say is 10 past 4. Anyways, thank you from the opposing and the proposing team. What I've gathered from this conversation is that everybody here, this is a very sensitive matter because we are all going through it. Now, the question is, do we privatize it? Don't we? They touched on funding, management, and accountability. At this point in time, it's a very, very tough discussion, and it we won't get to straight to the point over this conversation because there's a lot that was touched on. Firstly, about the blackouts, the safety of students going onto campuses, as well as accountability, both from the current state-owned entity, from the government. So do we privatize it? Do we gain some sort of accountability? Once it gets privatized, that is something that we definitely need to talk about. But for now, we will park it there, and you can definitely follow us on our social media platforms. It is hashtag UJTV, hashtag UJDU_take. Thank you so much, Team Opposition. Alex, that was phenomenal. But all I'm going to say is 10 past 4. I know that the load shedding has affected every one of us right here in South Africa. And the question is, even though we can privatize it, and as we can see, it's still a state-owned entity, transparency is still a problem. So that will be a conversation that will have to be much longer than this. As well as the funding, somebody touched on taxation, on how people will be taxed less, I guess. But I don't know, because this is all about you and I. We need to figure out what is the best decision for our country. Right now, it's still under the state's hands, and we are having continuous and endless blackouts. And also management, as Katleo here touched. He mentioned that organizational structural changes will mean increased unemployment, greater division of poverty within South Africa. As we know, within the first quarter of 2023, it's been recorded that 32.9% of South Africans are unemployed. So do we really think privatization is the way to go? I'll leave it over to you. Proposing team, final remarks.
Okay, so what we get from opposition, right, is they say that the public sector is trying to make the needs to make sure that Eskom is actually, efficient. They keep making these empty promises and we don't see the change. The only reason the public sector is trying or aiming to say that they have change is because the elections are approaching. That's the only reason.
Team proposition, that was a very valid point. Over to you, opposition team.
Okay, the proposing team never gave us the facts or never gave us the evidence that the privatization or this big movement of privatizing Eskom, it is a good movement, or they never give us facts telling us showing us whether the private sector is good or it will be bad for Eskom. All they're telling us is about the corrupt government. They're telling us about how government control it won't be good. We know if there's no government control, there will never be efficient. There will never be efficiency in the market, which means anyone can do whatever they like.
All right, over to you, Rock.
We know that privatization in this context is simply superior, right? In privatization, competition will lead to lower prices, right? They will lower their prices to stay competitive in the market, enabling millions of South Africans to be able to afford electricity. And if they want to stay competitive in the market, if they buy up Eskom, they'll have to be more efficient, as South Africans will flock to the company that's more efficient and is providing them with more electricity, right? On the opposition side, they have not explained how keeping government control of Eskom is essentially going to be a good thing. They've just told us that government control is good because the government. And they've also given us this thing that governments are the only ones who are supposed to provide basic needs, but governments do not produce food, they do not provide clothing, they do not provide housing to the majority of the population, right? So that responsibility does not only fall to the government, but also the private sector. And with that, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Rock. One more time for the opposition team. Alex, the floor is yours.
I think the main problem that we have with proposition is this idea that they still don't get what it means to actually have an onus that is literally given to you by the law. Private companies don't have an onus that they have to uphold as per the Constitution, as how the government has it. We think that it is very important then for government to actually be the person to deal with the basic necessities that have to do with a country. We don't think that when private companies actually come and take the fall, will come and take and assume this type of responsibility, it's actually something that's going to be seen because it only extends and only ends to corporate social responsibility. And that is not enough to fix Eskom.
And you've heard it right here on UJ Let's Talk. this house would privatize Eskom. You've heard the proposing and the opposing team, but we'll leave the verdict up to you. Make sure to follow us on our social media platforms. Remember to use the hashtag UJTV, hashtag DU. And also you can follow them on Instagram. It is UJ_debating. We'll see you in our next episode. Bye.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.